Pacific Theater in 1944. The jungle is heavy with rain. Mist clings to the mangled palm trees like ghostly shrouds. In a small clearing under the flickering light of kerosene lamps, American medics work through the night. Stretchers line the muddy ground. The sound of distant artillery hums like a dull heartbeat. A group of captured Japanese soldiers, gaunt and trembling, are marched into the camp. Their faces are blank masks, not from courage but from resignation. They have been told what awaits them: torture, humiliation, death. To surrender is shame. To fall into enemy hands is to lose honor, but what they see stops them cold. American nurses, young women in soaked fatigues, kneel beside the wounded. Not just their own men, but Japanese soldiers too. Bloodied bandages are changed. Morphine is administered. Hands that should have been their enemies are now holding them steady. The soldiers exchange bewildered glances. One whispers in disbelief. For the first time, fear is replaced by something unfamiliar. Relief, and this moment, was only the beginning. The Pacific War had entered its brutal middle years. By 1944, the tide had shifted. What began as a series of rapid Japanese conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific had turned into a grinding island-by-island struggle. The United States, now fully mobilized for total war, pushed relentlessly westward. Behind every amphibious landing and airstrike another. Quieter force was at work, the immense logistical and medical machine that kept hundreds of thousands of soldiers alive in one of the harshest combat environments on Earth. For Japan, the cultural and strategic framework was entirely different. Surrender was not simply discouraged, it was forbidden. Japanese military doctrine, shaped by centuries of Bushido ethos and reinforced by wartime propaganda, portrayed the enemy as merciless barbarians. Soldiers were taught that capture meant torture and dishonor. This belief was deeply internalized. It is why during early battles like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, so few Japanese soldiers allowed themselves to be taken alive. They fought to the death, detonated grenades to avoid capture, or staged suicidal last charges. The idea that an American medic might treat a wounded Japanese soldier was unimaginable to most imperial troops. On the American side, the approach to warfare included a strict adherence to the Geneva Convention and a highly organized medical corps. In the early years of the war, U.S. field medicine was still adapting to the jungle and island terrain, but by 1943-1944, it had evolved into a formidable system. Evacuation hospitals were set up near front lines, supported by hospital ships and air evacuation routes. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps were deployed in unprecedented numbers. These were young women, many barely in their 20s, who volunteered to work under fire, in primitive conditions, surrounded by death. The contrast between these two worlds, one driven by honor unto death, the other by a structured commitment to saving lives, would soon collide on the islands of the Pacific. American medical units were trained not only to treat their own wounded, but to handle prisoners of war. Surgical tents were erected within days of securing beachheads. Medics carried plasma through the mud. Surgeons worked by lantern light for 36 hours straight. Every casualty mattered, regardless of nationality. For the Japanese soldiers who had been told that Americans would mutilate them, this reality was disorienting. By mid-1944, major operations were underway in the Central Pacific, the Marianas, New Guinea, the Philippines. As U.S. forces advanced, they encountered increasing numbers of wounded Japanese who could no longer escape or commit suicide. Unlike earlier battles, not all were killed in last stands. Some were found unconscious in caves. Some were dragged from bunkers by Marines. Others, too weak to fight, were captured alive. These men carried not only wounds, but deeply ingrained expectations of cruelty. In these moments, the field hospitals became stages for a quiet drama. The American nurses, trained to focus only on the patient in front of them, began treating Japanese POWs with the same care they gave their own men. Their motivation was not political. It was professional and human. They followed procedures. They cleaned wounds, administered morphine, performed triage. The Japanese soldiers, used to images of brutal Western devils, stared in disbelief as their enemies held their hands during surgery. The world in 1944 was defined by industrial warfare, but in the dim tents of the Pacific, a different kind of power was being demonstrated. It was this collision of ideology and reality, of propaganda and compassion that would set the stage for one of the most unexpected, emotional turning points of the Pacific War. The setting for this story was not an abstract battlefield but a very real chain of islands that became decisive stepping stones toward Japan. In late 1944, one of the most intense of these campaigns unfolded in the Philippines. After years of Japanese occupation, American forces launched their massive return. General Douglas MacArthur's promise to liberate the islands was in motion. Amphibious landings, relentless airstrikes, and jungle combat defined the landscape. But behind the front lines, medical units were building small worlds of order amid chaos. The U.S. medical infrastructure in the Pacific was a marvel of organization. Within hours of a beachhead being secured, medical personnel moved in. Portable surgical hospitals, evacuation hospitals, and tented wards were erected on muddy ground. C-47 transport planes stood ready for air evacuation. Hospital ships waited offshore, their white hulls and red crosses visible even to enemy pilots. This was not improvisation. It was the result of years of planning by the U.S. Army Medical Department. By 1944, medical units were trained to follow closely behind assault forces. When Marines stormed a beach, doctors and nurses were not far behind. Among those nurses were hundreds of members of the Army Nurse Corps. They were stationed in tent hospitals where conditions were primitive and dangerous. Tropical heat made infection a constant threat. Malaria and dysentery stalked every camp. Enemy artillery sometimes reached their positions, yet their presence was constant. They set up operating rooms under canvas, sterilized instruments with makeshift equipment, and treated wounds inflicted by machine guns, shrapnel, and flamethrowers. In some cases, they worked within earshot of ongoing firefights. Japanese soldiers wounded during these campaigns arrived at these facilities in a very different state of mind. For years, Imperial Army propaganda had described Americans as sadistic monsters who would mutilate prisoners. Leaflets and military instruction manuals made this clear. Surrender meant torture or death. Even Japanese civilians on islands like Saipan and Okinawa were told that Americans would commit atrocities if they were captured. This propaganda led to countless suicides as Japanese soldiers and civilians chose death over surrender. For those who were captured alive, often because they were unconscious, too wounded to resist, or isolated in caves, entering an American medical camp was like stepping into another world. Many of these prisoners were transported under armed guard to rear area hospitals. Some were terrified, expecting to be executed at any moment. Others were silent, numb with pain and fear. What awaited them was not brutality but triage. American medics sorted them according to the severity of their injuries, just like their own men. The most critically wounded were operated on first. Surgeons opened chests to remove shrapnel. Nurses held IV bottles over stretchers, whispering short phrases of comfort in English that the Japanese soldiers couldn't understand. But the tone conveyed everything. On islands like Leyte and Luzon, this unexpected treatment began to spread by word of mouth among prisoners. Reports circulated through captured groups. The Americans were treating Japanese wounded. Some soldiers who had been saved by American doctors told their comrades in disbelief. For men raised to see the enemy as inhuman, this was almost incomprehensible. It shattered a psychological wall built over years of indoctrination. The locations were humid, swarming with mosquitoes scarred by artillery. But inside the hospitals there was a different atmosphere. Disciplined, focused, almost serene compared to the battlefield. The nurses and doctors were not motivated by mercy for the enemy. They were driven by duty and training. Yet the impact on Japanese prisoners was profound. Some stared at the nurses for hours, unable to reconcile what they had been taught with what they were seeing. Others, too weak to speak, simply lay still, watching their enemies save their lives. This was the real battlefield where ideologies cracked, not in dramatic charges, but on blood-soaked stretchers under canvas roofs. These encounters were the foundation for what would happen next. Moments when Japanese soldiers, once sworn to die rather than be captured, would beg to remain under American care rather than return to their units or camps. It was here that compassion became an unexpected strategic force. The human dimension of this story begins with disbelief. For many Japanese soldiers, the moment of capture was not only a physical defeat, but a psychological collapse. They had been raised in a military system where surrender was unthinkable. From their first day of training, they were told that the enemy was brutal and dishonorable. that death was preferable to capture, and that to fall into American hands was to face certain torture. So when these men were carried into American field hospitals, bloodied and broken, and saw nurses carefully treating them, the emotional shock was enormous. Some wept quietly. Others refused to make eye contact, as if acknowledging kindness from the enemy was itself a betrayal of everything they had been taught. For many, this was the first time they had been treated as individual human beings by an enemy force. From the American perspective, this was routine procedure. Medics and nurses were bound by both training and international law to treat all wounded, regardless of uniform. The U.S. military's medical corps functioned with military precision. There was no moral debate at the triage tent, only assessments of blood loss, breathing, and urgency. Japanese soldiers were placed in line according to severity, just like American soldiers. This dispassionate, methodical treatment had a profound human impact. The absence of cruelty was itself disarming. Tactically, the medical presence on the battlefield played a crucial stabilizing role. After each island was secured, the immediate task was to create order from chaos. Evacuate the wounded, process prisoners, and secure the area for future operations. Field hospitals acted as both humanitarian and military assets. They allowed American forces to save their own wounded quickly, which improved morale and combat endurance. But they also gave the military a means to handle Japanese captives efficiently. Wounded prisoners were often more cooperative, partly because they were dependent on their captors for survival. In some cases, information was obtained not through interrogation, but through medical interaction, prisoners volunteering details after realizing they would not be harmed. Compassion, in this sense, became a quiet tactical tool. Technologically, American medical operations in the Pacific were far ahead of what the Japanese Army could deploy in those isolated environments. Portable surgical kits, blood plasma transfusions, sulfa drugs, and organized air evacuation gave the Americans a decisive edge in casualty survival rates. By 1944, field hospitals could perform complex surgeries within hours of injury, something unheard of in earlier wars. Japanese forces, on the other hand, suffered catastrophic mortality among their wounded due to lack of supplies, inadequate evacuation, and cultural pressure against surrender. A wounded Japanese soldier left behind was often expected to die. There was little infrastructure to save him. When such men experienced American medical treatment, they were not just receiving aid. They were witnessing a level of technological and organizational capability that their own military could not match. The effect of this technological superiority was not only physical, but psychological. Japanese soldiers who had spent months in caves with festering wounds suddenly found themselves under clean canvas, with antiseptics, morphine, and professional care. This contrast was unforgettable. Some later recounted these moments in post-war memoirs, expressing confusion and even shame at their own disbelief. For them, the battlefield had turned into something entirely unexpected, a place where the enemy saved their lives instead of taking them. These intertwined human, tactical, and technological elements created a situation no wartime propagandist could have predicted. Acts that were standard for the Americans, medical triage, plasma transfusions, clean bandages, were transformative events for the Japanese prisoners who experienced them. And as more soldiers came into contact with these field hospitals, the impact rippled outward, touching leadership, enemy morale, and even strategic considerations. Leadership played a decisive role in shaping how these encounters unfolded. American commanders understood that medical operations were not just logistical necessities, they were powerful tools of influence. Official U.S. military policy, grounded in the Geneva Convention, required humane treatment of prisoners. But beyond legal obligations, there was a calculated strategic benefit. Commanders recognized that consistent, visible medical care for Japanese wounded could erode the enemy's will to fight. Leaflets were dropped encouraging surrender, and word of mouth among prisoners was sometimes more effective than any propaganda broadcast. When captured soldiers were treated humanely, news traveled back through informal networks, undermining the Imperial Army's rigid code. It wasn't kindness for kindness's sake alone. It was also psychological warfare, quiet, steady, and effective. On the Japanese side, leadership reacted with alarm and disbelief when reports of this treatment began filtering through. In some cases, Japanese officers interrogated returned prisoners who had been treated and released. Their accounts conflicted sharply with official propaganda. Some officers dismissed these stories as enemy deception. Others recognized their dangerous potential. If soldiers began to believe that surrender didn't automatically mean torture, the Imperial Army's entire motivational structure was at risk. This fear was not unfounded. By late 1944, there were documented cases of small groups of Japanese soldiers surrendering rather than fighting to the death, a behavior that would have been unthinkable in 1942. These were isolated incidents, but they reflected cracks in the ideological armor. The moral angle is perhaps the most striking. In the middle of one of history's most brutal wars, compassion became a weapon of unexpected power. Nurses and medics did not set out to break enemy morale. Their mission was medical. But their actions carried moral weight that transcended politics. To a wounded Japanese soldier, seeing an American nurse bend over him, clean his wounds, and administer morphine without hesitation was not just shocking. It was disarming in the truest sense. It challenged the fundamental narrative of the war he had been told. Many prisoners were deeply conflicted, torn between loyalty to their homeland's ideals and the undeniable reality of their treatment. There were accounts of prisoners quietly thanking nurses in broken English, bowing their heads or weeping when they realized they were not going to be executed. Some later testified that this experience changed their perception of Americans permanently. For the nurses themselves, the moral landscape was complex. They were fully aware that these men had, days earlier, tried to kill American soldiers. Yet they treated them with clinical detachment and a sense of duty that sometimes surprised even their male counterparts. In interviews after the war, several Army nurses spoke of the strangeness of holding the hand of a man who might have been their enemy that morning. For them, the operating tent became neutral ground, a place where the war's ideologies temporarily dissolved. This moral force also influenced broader strategy. By maintaining a reputation for humane treatment, the United States undermined Japanese propaganda not through speeches, but through lived reality. Every soldier saved became a living contradiction of Tokyo's claims. Every prisoner who returned with his life intact carried a story that the Japanese high command could not easily suppress. In this way, leadership decisions at the top, enemy perceptions in the middle, and moral actions at the ground level converged to create a situation that no single policy could have produced. It was not planned as a grand psychological operation, but its effects were undeniable. These angles, leadership's strategic foresight, the enemy's ideological cracks, and the moral weight of compassion, set the stage for a decisive moment. The collision of propaganda and reality would soon reach a breaking point inside the canvas walls of a field hospital. It began with the thunder of distant artillery. The Leyte campaign in the Philippines was reaching its critical phase in late 1944. Rain poured steadily over the shattered landscape. Mangrove swamps, rice paddies, and tangled jungle formed a treacherous battleground. American infantry pushed inland, supported by tanks and artillery, while Japanese forces, cut off and cornered, fought with desperate ferocity. In the chaos of advancing lines, scores of wounded were left scattered across the terrain, Americans and Japanese alike. Near the coast, a large U.S. field hospital had been established just beyond artillery range. Canvas tents stretched in orderly rows. Wooden walkways tried unsuccessfully to keep the mud at bay. Inside, the air smelled of wet earth, blood, and disinfectant. Generators hummed, powering a handful of bare light bulbs that cast pale yellow light over operating tables. Nurses moved quickly, their fatigue soaked and boots caked with mud. Surgeons worked in shifts, their hands numb from hours of operations. The steady rhythm of plasma dripping into glass bottles filled the silence between the screams. That evening, a group of wounded Japanese soldiers was brought in by truck under guard. They were barely conscious. Some had been pulled from collapsed bunkers, others from the jungle where they had lain for days. Their wounds were severe, shrapnel embedded deep, untreated fractures, festering infections. As they were unloaded, some flinched, expecting to be beaten. Instead, they were carried on stretchers, their wounds assessed with practiced efficiency. A triage officer barked instructions. Abdominal wound first, compound fracture second, head trauma third. It was the same protocol applied to every patient. Inside the operating tent, the scene was intense but controlled. A Japanese soldier with a chest wound was placed on the table. He was barely breathing. A nurse wiped the blood from his face. The surgeon made a swift incision, working to remove the shrapnel lodged near the lung. Another nurse held a bottle of plasma high, her arm trembling from fatigue. There was no hesitation, no visible hatred. To them, this was another body to save before the next arrived. Nearby, another prisoner lay on a stretcher watching. His eyes followed every movement of the nurses. He had been told that Americans would torture him. Instead, he saw them pressing gauze to wounds, checking pulses, whispering short reassurances he didn't understand but instinctively felt. His breath came in short gasps, partly from pain, partly from disbelief. A young nurse noticed him staring. She adjusted his IV, offered him a sip of water, and moved on. For him, that small act, so ordinary to her, overturned years of indoctrination. The night stretched on. Operating tables rotated patients one after another. American and Japanese soldiers were treated side by side, separated only by language and uniform. The nurses didn't stop to reflect. They simply worked. But for the Japanese soldiers lying on those stretchers, this was the moment when everything they had been told began to unravel. The enemy was not mutilating them. The enemy was saving them. As the first light of dawn crept through the jungle canopy, the atmosphere in the tent shifted. Several of the Japanese wounded had survived surgeries they would never have received in their own army. One man awoke groggily to see the nurse who had operated on him adjusting his bandages. He tried to speak but couldn't form the words. Instead, he bowed his head weakly. She nodded, then moved to the next patient. This night became one of those quiet, undocumented turning points. No grand speeches, no formal surrender. Just blood, mud, exhaustion, and unexpected humanity. For the American medical staff, it was another brutal night of war. For the Japanese soldiers, it was a moment of irreversible realization. In the following days, word began to spread through the groups of captured Japanese soldiers recovering in the hospital wards. Those who could speak whispered to those who could not. They described in disbelief how the Americans had operated on them through the night, how nurses had tended to their wounds with care normally reserved for comrades, and how no one had been executed or humiliated. In the heat and humidity of Leyte, this quiet flow of information traveled quickly through the prisoner compounds like a current beneath the surface of war. Some of these men were in no condition to be moved. Their wounds required weeks of recovery. When the time came for them to be transferred to prisoner of war camps farther behind the lines, something unexpected happened. Several of them pleaded to remain in the American field hospitals. Through broken English, gestures, or the help of interpreters, they begged to stay. They had been indoctrinated to fear torture at American hands, yet here they were, asking not to leave. They trusted their survival to the enemy more than to their own army's grim fate. The reports of this phenomenon reached American officers, who noted it with surprise. These were not isolated cases. Medical officers described Japanese prisoners expressing fear of being returned to Japanese custody, where untreated wounds, starvation, or execution for surrender awaited them. Some prisoners told interpreters that they believed they would die if removed from the American hospital, not because of mistreatment by Americans, but because the care they were receiving was more advanced and more humane than anything they had experienced before. A few even wept when told they had to leave, clinging to the stretchers or bowing deeply to the nurses who had treated them. For the Japanese command structure, these developments were alarming. Prisoners who were returned sometimes spoke of their treatment in guarded tones, but the truth spread nonetheless. Some soldiers at the front began to question the absolute certainty of propaganda. The psychological barrier that had once ensured near universal refusal to surrender was weakening, at least at the margins. This did not lead to mass capitulation. The Bushido Code and peer pressure remained powerful. But for the first time, the idea of surrender was no longer universally synonymous with horror. In isolated instances, small groups chose capture over certain death, influenced by the stories of those who had survived under American care. The nurses themselves were often unaware of the impact they were having. In post-war interviews, some described how prisoners would bow repeatedly as they were transferred, or how they noticed subtle changes in the way new captives looked at them. Less terror, more cautious curiosity. For them, Their actions were part of their duty, not a deliberate campaign to change hearts and minds. But the effects were undeniable. Compassion, delivered through routine medical practice, was altering the psychology of war. From a strategic perspective, these moments dovetailed with American psychological operations. Leaflets were already being dropped encouraging surrender, emphasizing humane treatment. Loudspeakers broadcast messages across battle lines, but it was not words that carried the greatest weight. It was lived experience. When prisoners begged to remain in American hospitals, they became living refutations of Imperial Japan's wartime narrative. This was the turning point, the moment when battlefield ideology met undeniable reality. No commander had ordered nurses to break enemy morale. No policy dictated that compassion be weaponized. Yet through the simple act of treating the wounded without discrimination, American medical personnel had opened a fissure in one of the most rigid military cultures of the war. That fissure would continue to widen in the months that followed, quietly shaping the way Japanese soldiers perceived surrender and captivity. What followed was the long aftermath of these encounters, the slow transformation of prisoner treatment statistics, surrender patterns, and post-war memories. In the months that followed, the consequences of these encounters became visible in both statistics and behavior. By late 1944 and into 1945, as the U.S. advanced deeper into the Philippines and toward Japan's inner defensive ring, the number of Japanese soldiers surrendering, though still small compared to other armies, began to rise. In earlier campaigns like Tarawa or Guadalcanal, surrender rates had been negligible. Entire garrisons had fought to the last man. But on Leyte and later on Luzon, American forces began to encounter slightly larger groups willing to lay down their arms, many of them wounded. Military intelligence officers attributed part of this shift to the spread of first-hand stories from prisoners treated in American medical facilities, prisoner of war. Camps in the Pacific Theater began to hold increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers. These camps were not idyllic. Conditions varied widely depending on location and resources, but for the wounded, medical treatment continued according to U.S. Army regulations. Hospital wards were established inside or adjacent to camps, staffed by military doctors and nurses. Red Cross inspections were conducted periodically. Reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross documented relatively consistent adherence to the Geneva Convention by U.S. forces. Prisoners were fed, clothed, and, crucially, treated. Mortality rates among Japanese POWs held by the United States were significantly lower than those held by the Japanese themselves, a stark contrast that became known through whispered stories among frontline troops. For the American Medical Corps, these developments reinforced the importance of their work beyond immediate battlefield survival. Their mission had always been to save lives, but now they saw its ripple effects in enemy behavior. Surgeons and nurses who had operated under fire on Leyte began to receive follow-up reports about their former patients, now stable in POW hospitals. Some of these prisoners even assisted in camp operations as orderlies, drawing on the care they had received to help others. What had begun as routine triage had become a mechanism of influence. Among Japanese prisoners, attitudes slowly shifted. Many still carried deep loyalty to their emperor and country, but the absolute certainty of American cruelty had been fractured. In POW camps, some prisoners admitted to interrogators that they had expected to be executed and were astonished by their survival. A few volunteered information about their units or defensive positions, not out of coercion, but out of a complex mixture of gratitude, disillusionment, and pragmatism. Intelligence officers understood that humane treatment could yield valuable insights without physical force. For the American public, stories of nurses treating enemy wounded rarely made the front pages. The focus remained on battles, victories, and sacrifices. But within military medical circles, these events were noted with quiet pride. Nurses and doctors received commendations for bravery under fire, not for psychological impact, but for their dedication in impossible conditions. They rarely saw themselves as part of a larger strategic picture. Yet unknowingly, they had become agents of soft power on the battlefield. For the Japanese leadership, the growing number of prisoners posed an ideological challenge. Official propaganda continued to portray Americans as barbaric. Reports from returning prisoners were censored, and those who surrendered were often considered disgraced. But reality was difficult to suppress completely. Rumors spread through surviving units. Some soldiers began to question the inevitability of death in battle. While these shifts did not lead to mass surrenders, Japan's military code remained rigid until the war's end. They introduced doubt, and in a system built on absolute conviction, doubt was dangerous. This was the quiet aftermath, a slow, statistical, psychological transformation playing out in camps, hospitals, and whispered conversations between men who had once been enemies. The battlefield moment had passed, but its consequences were still unfolding across the Pacific. As the war drew closer to Japan's home islands, the long-term consequences of these encounters became increasingly clear. Prisoners who had survived under American care often carried these experiences with them far beyond the battlefield. Many were later transferred to larger camps in Australia, Hawaii, or the continental United States, where medical treatment continued in regulated facilities. Some spent months recovering from wounds that, under Japanese military care, would have been fatal. These men emerged not only physically healed but psychologically marked by the contrast between expectation and reality. American nurses and doctors, meanwhile, rotated through campaigns and assignments, often unaware of the lasting influence they had on their former patients. After the capture of Saipan, Leyte, and Luzon, similar stories repeated themselves. Prisoners pleading to remain in hospitals, thanking their captors, and spreading their accounts to others. By 1945, intelligence summaries noted that surrender leaflets were increasingly effective when coupled with credible testimony from captured soldiers. In other words, the words on paper mattered less than the living proof of those who had experienced American care firsthand. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, many of these former prisoners returned home. There, their experiences collided with a society still shaped by years of wartime propaganda. Some remained silent, fearing shame or punishment. Others quietly told family members of the medical treatment they had received. Over time, these stories filtered into post-war narratives, often as quiet personal testimonies rather than official accounts. A few of these men contributed to oral histories decades later, describing their shock and gratitude at being saved by the enemy. For them, the face of the American soldier was not that of a torturer, but of a nurse adjusting a bandage under the dim light of a field hospital. The impact of these experiences extended into post-war U.S.-Japan relations. During the American occupation of Japan, efforts to rebuild the nation's medical infrastructure included exchanges of knowledge between American and Japanese doctors. Some former POWs who had received treatment in U.S. facilities played a role in facilitating communication, using their experiences as a bridge. The memory of humane treatment by medical personnel contrasted sharply with the devastation of bombings and combat, creating a more complex and nuanced perception of the former enemy among segments of the Japanese population. Within the U.S. military, these events helped shape evolving doctrines on the treatment of prisoners and the role of medical services in modern warfare. The Geneva Conventions were reaffirmed, and the moral and strategic value of humane treatment became increasingly recognized. Lessons learned in the Pacific would later inform how field hospitals operated in conflicts like Korea and Vietnam. Compassion, once viewed purely as a humanitarian obligation, was now also understood as a subtle but powerful instrument of influence. For the nurses who served on those islands, most never considered themselves part of a strategic shift. After the war, many returned home quietly, their experiences recorded only in letters or occasional interviews decades later. Yet their work had left an imprint on thousands of lives, both American and Japanese. They had transformed the battlefield not through weapons, but through discipline, skill, and humanity. The aftermath of those field hospital encounters was not measured in headlines, but in changed minds, altered statistics, and the quiet survival of men who expected death, but found life in the hands of their enemies. These ripples would continue long after the guns fell silent, shaping memory, policy, and even reconciliation between two nations once locked in total war. When the war finally ended, the world took stock of its ruins in factories, cities, and cemeteries. But some of the most enduring changes came from moments that left no craters. In the humid, dimly lit wards of field hospitals under the hands of exhausted nurses and surgeons, something quietly human had happened. The war in the Pacific was one of the most brutal campaigns in modern history, fought without mercy, shaped by racial hatred, and fueled by absolute ideological convictions. Yet within that storm, compassion found a foothold. For the Japanese soldiers who experienced American medical care, these encounters became memories that defied propaganda. They had been prepared to die, told that their captors would mutilate or kill them. Instead, they awoke to nurses checking their pulse, changing their bandages, and saving their lives without hesitation. That simple reality created fractures in the hardest of beliefs. No leaflet or speech could have done what one act of kindness repeated thousands of times accomplished. It was proof that humanity can manifest even amid total war. For the Americans, this was not a grand moral crusade. It was procedure, discipline, and duty. Yet their adherence to these principles became a weapon more powerful than they realized, one that reached beyond the battlefield, shaping surrender patterns, influencing intelligence, and sowing doubt in enemy ranks. Compassion did not end the war, but it changed its texture, leaving behind a legacy written not in explosions, but in the quiet rhythm of surgical tools and whispered reassurances. History often remembers wars for their violence. But sometimes the most profound impacts come from the moments when violence pauses, when hands meant to harm instead heal. In those tents, surrounded by mud, blood, and the distant echoes of artillery, humanity briefly overcame ideology. And for some men, that made all the difference.